old Sturbridge Village in central Massachusetts is a perfect place to come and spend a day reliving history. You know, one of my favorite collections here are the children's wooden toys. Come on, and look at this, a classic cup and ball. See if I can do this. Hey, not bad. And look at over here, some hand-painted wooden blocks. And in front of it here is a very delicate, dainty wagon. You know, you won't find all of these things on display if you happen to come here for a visit. They've been put out especially for our trip here, but you will find this rocking horse. It's made of pine, has a curved bottom so it'll rock, a footrest, a nice heart-shaped saddle, and a very friendly, horsey-looking face. I think this is something we can build. Now I'd like to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your tools. Knowing how to use your tools safely will considerably lessen the possibility of personal injury. And remember this, the most important safety rule is to wear these safety glasses. Now I'll show you how I built today's project. Well, it's remarkable that that old rocking horse lasted all these years, especially since it's made out of a softwood. To make sure ours is going to last, I chose a hardwood, in this case, ash. And the first thing I did to get started was to do some glue-ups. And I glued two 1x8s together. They're about 4 feet long. And I'll wet the ends here to show you the alternating growth rings. On this board, they're curving downward. And on this one, they're curving upward. And this will keep the boards flatter to one another. Now, out of each 4-foot section, I'll get one of these side pieces and one of these cross braces. There's one at the front, and there's one at the back. Now, the first thing I want to do is unclamp the boards and scrape off any excess glue. Okay, that takes care of the excess glue. Now, while I was out at Sturbridge Village, I took some measurements, and from those measurements, I was able to make a pattern. I'll just slip it on here. Now, you notice that the top of the rocking horse goes over the side pieces. I'm going to make my sides a little wider. You can see I've extended it about 1 inch, and I'll trim those off later. All I have to do is take the pattern, align it with the top edge of my boards, and simply trace it. Now, the idea here is to get two panels that are exactly the same. So to do that, I'm going to line them up along the top edge and fasten them together with a couple screws. And because this is a hardwood, I'm going to pre-drill the holes. Well, I suppose I could use a circular saw or my table saw to trim off this excess that I'll use later. I think I'll use my radial arm. Well, the next thing to do is to cut out the side pieces. And I could use a handheld jigsaw, and I will be using one of those in a minute. But ideally, it's nice to have a bandsaw like this one. Now, even with a really good bandsaw blade, you still end up with imperfections after cutting these curves. They're a little bit rough. And especially with this rocking horse, I want the bottom of this surface to be nice and even, because if it has bumps, it's going to jump around as it rocks. And to smooth all that out, I'm going to use what's called as a drum sander. Now, with the two pieces separated, I'm ready to cut a mortise right here. Let's go over to our prototype and take another look. The mortise is for these footrests. And if you look at the rocking horse, the sides are tapered at 12.5 degrees. So if I cut a square mortise through there, my footrest is going to go in at an angle, and it certainly isn't going to come out on the other side. So the mortise will have to also be at 12.5 degrees. Now what I'm going to do first is take a square and set it on the edge of my bench at 12.5 degrees. Then I'm going to take my bevel gauge and set it to that same angle. Just tighten down my thumb screw. And now I've got like a template that I can use in combination with my drill. And when I line up my drill by eye with the gauge, I'll get a 12.5 degree hole. And I'll make one hole on each end of the layout. Okay, now I will use my electric jigsaw. And I have to set its table at 12.5 degrees also. And again, I'll use the bevel gauge and just line up the blade itself. And now I can use this to remove the rest of the material. Now to finish cleaning out the rest of the mortise, I've tilted my table 12.5 degrees on the other side of 0. And now I'll just nibble out the remaining material. The next thing I want to do is cut a couple dados in the sides for the front and back braces. That dado will add some strength, plus it looks a lot nicer. Well, the first thing I want to do is lay it out. And it's going to be at a 15-degree angle to the top. So I use my square here on 15 degrees in about 1.5 inches from the end. And I'll just draw a line. I don't want to go all the way through, so I'm going to come back from the bottom of the arc about 1.25 inches. That'll be my stopping point. Now using my router with a 1/2 inch straight cutter in it and a cleat for a guide, which I'll screw on, and this is the inside of the rocking horse so the screw holes won't show later, I'll plow out the dado. Well, the next thing I want to do is bevel the top edge of the sides. It's the same 12.5 degrees that we've been working with. Now I'm going to use my contractor's saw today. It's a lot lighter and a lot less costly than the shop saw that you normally see me use, but it does the job just as well. Now I'm going to take the scraps that were left over from the sides and make these cross pieces. And the first thing I want to do is rip them down to 10.25 inches. Now I'll take these pieces and bevel each side at 12.5 degrees. Now I could do that on the table saw, but it's a lot easier with the radial arm. These cross pieces fit in the dados. And in order to cover up the end of the dado, I'm going to make a little notch in each piece. So first I mark the depth of the dado by simply holding it down in the bottom. Then I line up the top edge so that it's flush, and just approximately mark how much material I have to remove. I'm going to clamp it in my vise, square line across the top, and I'll cut it out using my back saw, which has very fine teeth and a very stiff back piece up here so that I get nice, straight, smooth cuts. The next thing I want to do is start working on the footrest. Now it starts out as a piece of 1x3 ash. It goes all the way through. Because it's slightly tipped, this angle is a compound angle. It's less than 90 degrees. It's about 2 degrees, in fact. And I'll cut the ends of my piece over here on the miter box. Well, the next thing I want to do is rip the ends of the foot down narrow enough so it fits through the mortise. That's about 2.5 inches. And I'll do that on the table saw. This little notch that I've cut right here will stop the foot from sliding back and forth in the rocking horse. Well, once again, I'll turn to my drum sander and round off the ends of the foot. I want to round over the edges of the footrest, but I don't want the round over to go beyond my mortise, so I'm just going to draw a pencil line around. That way I won't have any gaps showing later. And I'll ease the edges using a router with a 1/4 inch rounding over bit. And I'm going to use this friction pad because it allows me to route small pieces of work and they won't slide around. It actually holds them in place without clamps. There's no better time than now to round over the edges of the side pieces. Let's assemble what we've made. A little bit of glue in the dado, and then our cross piece. We'll flip this over, and I'll drill a pilot hole with a counter bore for some screws. Before I drill any more, I'll fasten this with a drywall screw. Each side panel will be secured to the cross braces with 4 drywall screws. This is the time to put the footrest in, because if you forget, you're going to hate yourself in the morning. The seat, or the top of the rocking horse, is made from 1 1/4 inch thick ash. And the saddle, the front and back pieces, have tenons, and I'll pull those out so that we can see the mortises that go all the way through. And they're at 15 degrees. So what I'm going to do is go over to my drill press, where I have a 3/4 inch Forstner bit set up, and I'm going to drill 2 holes down at each location. To finish the mortise, I'll just use a couple sharp chisels to square it up. I've plowed out a groove for the head and the tail to sit in. Next, I want to start shaping the saddle. I'll put the face side down and make a 12.5 degree cut on each edge. Now I'm going to tilt the saw up to 20 degrees. Now I'll move the fence over to about 3/4 of an inch. This time I'll hold the piece up and down on edge, holding the bottom of the seat flat against the rip fence. I'll secure the saddle as I did with the sides, using some glue, pre-drilling some pilot holes, and using drywall screws. Now, to fill the holes that I've made with the counter bore, I need to use some dowels. Now, I could go to the lumber yard and buy maple ones, but they won't match the rest of the wood in the project. So I'm going to use a plug cutter, which is a tool like this, set up in my drill press, and I'll just cut my own plugs out of a piece of scrap. You just take a screwdriver, pop them out of the board, put a little glue on, and just stick them in the hole, drive it down with my hammer, and I'll sand them off in a little while. Front and the back of the saddle are these heart-shaped pieces, and there's a little tenon down at the bottom. And I've traced the outline from a pattern I made onto a piece of wood, and I'll cut it on my bandsaw. In order to make these saddle pieces fit tightly down onto the seat, I'm going to need to make a little angled shoulder cut here. I'm just going to use a pair of dividers to lay it out, and I'll cut them with my little dovetailing saw. Well, the head and the tail of the rocking horse are made from 1¼ inch thick stock. And I did have to glue a couple pieces together to get a piece this wide for the head. And I was very fortunate to be able to trace the outlines of the pieces when I was out at Sturbridge. So I've laid out the head and the tail, and now it's back to the bandsaw and the drum sander. For the areas that I can't really get with a drum sander because they're so tight, I just use this little rasp. Now, to make the final cut on the head and the tail where it fits up against the saddle, I want to make sure that this fits tightly, so I'll just use a pair of dividers to measure this distance, and then just transfer it over to here, and that shows me where I want to make my cut. Now, I'll take the head over to the miter box. And the miter box is set at 15 degrees, but because there's a little lip here, my head isn't going to be parallel. So to make sure it's parallel, I'm just going to slip in a piece of scrap wood. Now that fits pretty good. Now I'm going to take all these pieces out and sand the plugs and the saddle. I want to continue this quarter round up over the end of the saddle, and I'll use the same router setup that I used before. Now these holes with countersinks are for the screws to hold the head and the tail. The countersink will help conceal the head of the screw. Now I'll just take the head and slip it into the slot and drill a pilot hole into the head for the screw. A little bit of glue, and I'll fasten it in place with a 2-inch drywall screw. From inside the horse, I have additional places to put screws up into the head and tail. Okay, we're getting there now. Now we can stand it up and slip the saddle pieces in, and once again pre-drill some holes. This front part of the saddle is going to take a lot of punishment. That's what's going to get pulled on when there's a little child on here rocking. So I want to make sure it's secure, so a little glue on that tenon and a screw. I'll just put a plug in that hole. And that's about it. When the glue dries, I'll sand down that plug, and then I'm ready for some kind of finish. Boy, that is smooth. And it should be, given the number of hours that I spent sanding it, until I got down to a very fine grit sandpaper. And I found out the hard way that sanding is the secret to a good finish. I'm going to start out staining this piece, and I'm going to use a maple-colored stain. I'm going to apply it with an ordinary paintbrush, and I think I'll stain the whole thing, inside and out. Now, because this ash is a hardwood, it's going to take a little bit longer for the stain to soak in. So I'm going to let it sit on there for about 15 minutes, and then I'll wipe off any excess with a clean rag. Now, that stain is set up pretty good now. Now I'll rub off the excess. And what I want to do is first start out removing the stain by rubbing across the grain like this. And now what I'm going to do is go with the grain, like this. I think that's just about the color that I want. The stain has had sufficient time to dry, and here I'm applying the first of 2 finished coats. And I've chosen a polyurethane finish, which is very hard, and it's a high gloss. Hey, Corey, what do you think of this horsey? You like it?
Yeah.
Yeah, you got a name for it yet?
Yeah.
What is it? Cactus? That's a good name.